God's providence, I want to just start with by sharing that God's providence is tied to time. His providence is tied to time. If you've noticed as you've been reading throughout Esther, that there's a lot of references to time throughout all the chapters that we've been reading. We have time words such as when and then and later and after these events and on the third day and on the 13th day and then the first month, in the 12th month, and then we have that day and that night. All these different words throughout Esther reminding us that God's providence is tied to time. In fact, there's also references to the various years of Xerxes' reign. Chapter 1, we saw it was in the 3rd year of his reign. And in chapter 2, we see that it was in the 7th year of his reign. And then chapter 3, it was in the 12th year of his reign. And then the last 2 sessions, we've looked at how Mordecai and Esther have come to believe that God had put them where they were at the time that they were for such a time, there's the word time, as this. You see, time is all the way throughout the book of Esther because God's providence is tied to time. And not only that, but God's working providentially takes time. Have you noticed that? We started out in Esther chapter 1, and it's been 9 years since Esther chapter 1. When Xerxes had his banquets, and then his queen Vashti didn't come when he summoned her, and he deposed her. And then it's been 5 years since Esther chapter 2 when Esther was made queen. And Mordecai overheard the assassination plot and reported it to Xerxes. God's working providentially takes time. And he's taken all this time, these 9 years, to set the stage for where we're at right now. For Esther chapter 5 and 6. And it sometimes seems like that God just takes his time. And we probably feel that sometimes as he's working out his plan in our own lives or when it comes to his answering our prayers. Am I right on that? It just seems like, boy, God's just taking his time. And it can be very frustrating to us, can it? How many of us here have prayed and prayed and prayed and fasted and prayed for certain things that we are absolutely certain is in line with God's will? And yes, let's see your hands. How many have done that? And you're still waiting for the answer. How many are still waiting for the answer? Oh, look at those hands. Look around. You're not alone. Yes. When we cry out, why isn't God answering? Why isn't he doing something? And what I want us to see tonight is that God is doing something, that God is taking his time because he has a purpose for it. And one of the purposes has to do with our hearts, that God is taking time in order to work in our hearts, to get us ready possibly for the next stage of our life, or to get us ready for that answer that he's getting ready to bring to us. We love to be fast learners, wouldn't we? But we're not. We're not fast learners. That's why it takes kids 12, 18, 20 years to get through school. That's why we come to church every Sunday, or we study the Word every day, because we need to learn, because faith is our spiritual muscle, and just like physical muscles have to be continually exercised in order to develop, it takes time for our faith to develop. And so often, God is taking time to develop his people to receive what he has for them. And what we've been seeing is that's what he's been doing with Mordecai and Esther. But also God takes time in order to be able to work in others. Because sometimes our prayer concerns others. And it's not just about us, but it's about them. And so God's not only working on our hearts, but he's working on their hearts as well in order to bring about that answer. Maybe you're praying for someone's salvation. Maybe you're praying for someone to become fully developed disciples of Jesus Christ. And you're wondering, when's it going to happen? And God's working on their hearts, but it takes time. Or maybe he's wanting to answer a prayer that we have for a particular need, or something that we want him to do for us, but he wants to do it through someone else. And he's still working on that someone else in order to bring that answer to us. And also it gives him time to work through occurrences, through circumstances, through events, because that's how he works. That's what his providence does. He works through people. He works through events and circumstances, and he orchestrates, and he connects, and he interconnects, and it takes time for him to do all of that. So God's providence is tied to time, but his providential working takes time. But thirdly, God's providence is all about God's timing. God's timing. God's timing involves two things. It involves him doing something at the right time, at just the right time. But it also involves wait time. And wait time is what we could call delay time. It's, I'm not sure when the answer is going to come time. It's in due time. The answer is going to come in due time, but we don't know when that time is. And so nearly 30 times in the Bible, we are instructed to wait on the Lord. Wait on the Lord, and you'll renew your strength. Wait on the Lord. Wait on the Lord. Over 30 times in the Scriptures. Waiting on the Lord isn't just waiting. It's waiting in trust. It's waiting in faith. It's waiting and trusting that the Lord is working, putting things together, arranging all the pieces, the places, the people, so that he will accomplish his purpose for our lives, or his answer for our prayers at just the right time. The right time is the most important time when it comes to God's providence. And so, waiting on the Lord, as we can see up here, is trusting God's heart when we can't see his hand. And so what we see coming up now in Esther 5 and 6 is what happens basically in one day's time. It all occurs in one day's time, 5, 6, and 7. All happens within 24 hours. But it's taken 9 years to get here. It's taken 9 years of God's working and moving and interconnecting and working to get to this place. But it shows us that while we are waiting, God is always working. And so I want us to look here, and I'm just going to walk us through 5 and 6. We've had it read to us, so I'm just going to allude to different references, and you can look at it in your scriptures. You might want to have it open. But I want us to see the miraculous and mysterious way in which God intersects and interconnects 4 events in order to bring about his purpose, the purpose he's been working towards throughout the book of Esther. And so the first event is Esther's hesitation. Esther's hesitation. And we see this in the first 8 verses, and we covered this last week. You're probably wondering, I thought we did this, and we did. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on it. I just want to allude back to it to say, as we just saw, Esther went before the king after fasting and praying, and he asked what did she want. He'd give her up to half the kingdom. That was his way of saying, I'll be generous as long as it doesn't lessen my authority. And she says to him, I want you and Haman to come to a banquet that she'd already had prepared. So Xerxes gets Haman, and they head to the banquet, and they have the banquet going on, and we're told that they were drinking wine as usual, and then Xerxes again says to her, now tell me, Esther, what's your request, what's your petition, up to half the kingdom? And she says, I want you to come to a second banquet tomorrow. And we notice that she hesitates to make the real request known. And I just want to make a couple additional comments from last week. Why did Esther hesitate? And I indicated last week it could very well be that because she'd been praying and fasting, and that causes someone to become much more sensitive to the Lord, that she was sensitive to his leading and sensed that he did not want her to tell them the request yet. Or it might be she just felt a check in her spirit. She didn't know if this is what God wanted her to do or not, but for some reason she didn't feel the situation was right yet. And so she says, come back for a second banquet and I'll tell you then. Or it could also be that she had become overcome by fear. And maybe fear won out for a moment. And she realized how powerful the responsibility was upon her, because whatever her request was to save the annihilation of all the Jews. This was a critical moment, and maybe she had become overcome by fear and hesitant to even ask at that time, and still needed some time to build up courage. We can't say for sure because the scriptures don't say for sure. It just simply says she invites them back to a second banquet. But this section shows us that during the period of delays, delays are necessary. They're a necessary part of God's working out his plan. But what I want us to see here tonight as well is it doesn't matter if it was because we were doing God's will and we know for sure he didn't want me to share there, or I was afraid and I didn't share. It doesn't matter. God still works. You and I cannot thwart God's plan. That's what I want us to see tonight. Whether the delay is because we know we're doing God's will, or if the delay is because we failed or we fumbled, or maybe it's because of our fault. Maybe some of us have wanted to do something or share with somebody and we missed the opportunity and we felt guilty. Well, God's not through yet. God might be using that period of delay from that last time to maybe the next opportunity that comes to prepare your heart and that person's heart. All I'm saying is, I'm not saying that this gives us a license to disobey God and to go against his word. What I am saying is that God is not restricted, or his plan is not thwarted because we fumble. And I hope that gives us all some hope, that God promises to work all things, including our fumbles and our failures, together for our good and for his purposes. Does that give you a sense of hope? Because we've all done that. We've all done that. There's not a person in this room that can say, I perfectly obey God, I perfectly know what his will is all the time, and I do it. We have all looked back with senses of regret, and maybe we've dropped the ball, and maybe we've blown our opportunity. And my answer to you is, from the scriptures, that is not true. Esther and Mordecai had dropped the ball, as I tried to show at the early part, but God kept working with them to bring them to the point, and they never thwarted his plan. He's right on schedule. So, Esther's hesitation. We don't know why she hesitated for sure, but she hesitated. This leads to the second event, and that is Haman's gallows. And we see this in Esther chapter 5, verses 9 through 14. And as the scripture said, Haman went out that day happy and in high spirits. He was in high spirits because he consumed a lot of wine, for one thing, so he was in high spirits. But he was also in high spirits because he was consumed with himself. And the thing is, he was the guest of honor at that banquet. Now, he's at a banquet with the king, and the king is always the guest of honor. But at this particular banquet, Haman was invited specifically. He's the guest of honor. And so his pride is swelling. And so he walks out of there consumed with himself, that he's really something. He went to a banquet with just the king and the queen, and he was the guest of honor. And verse 8 goes on to tell us that he walks out the king's gate. I put this up here. I've shown this several times, but you see the king's gate right there at the bottom left. That's the king's gate. And so he walks out from the palace through the king's gate, and there is Mordecai sitting there in his sackcloth and ashes. And we're told that as he walked by, again, Mordecai refuses, as always, to acknowledge him, refuses to bow to him, refuses to stand and acknowledge that he is a person of authority. And this creates rage within Haman. But Haman is able to restrain himself. And verse 10 tells us that he goes on home. He calls his wife and friends together in verse 10. And then he recalls all of his prideful accomplishments. Why? He's trying to boost himself up by boasting. Again, when people are prideful and proud and they're boasting about themselves, it's usually putting people down by lifting ourselves up. So he's trying to put, again, Mordecai down and lift himself up because he is been humiliated again by Mordecai's refusal to stand. And so we are told in verse 11 that he boasts to them about his vast wealth, his many sons, and all the ways the king has honored him, and how the king had elevated him above the other nobles and officials. And just as they had hoped that he had finished boasting, he adds, and that's not all. Verse 12, I'm the only person Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet she gave, and she has invited me to come along again with the king tomorrow. And then verse 13, he shares that all of this, however, gives him no satisfaction as long as I see Mordecai. And so his friends and his wife makes a simple suggestion. Do away with Mordecai. Get rid of him. Don't wait for that 12th month when you're going to annihilate all the Jews. Do it now. Build a gallows tonight, 75 feet high. I put this picture in here. I don't know if you can see it or not. That is a pillar of the Temple of Diana, or name slipped me right now, but the Temple of Diana in Sardis. Cindy and I are right here. I'm 6'3". That's 65 feet tall. So I just wanted you to get a little perspective that they told Haman, build a gallows 75 feet. So add 10 more feet to that. That's how tall the gallows would be. And as you heard in the reading, the gallows was not like your typical Western gallows with a noose hanging down and the trap door to give way. It was a pole that stood up, and it was pointed at the top. And what they did was they thrust the victim down on the pole so that he or she would be impaled by the pole and left there to squirm until they bled out and died. And they either did that by sitting them down in the groin and coming up through their throat and their mouth, or through putting them over so it goes through their stomach. Pretty gruesome. Pretty gruesome. But you see, the gallows weren't just for execution. The gallows were for display. It was a way of displaying the victim. It was a way of saying, look, this is what this victim did, and this is what happened to him, and if you do what this victim did, it's going to happen to you too. So Haman is saying, look, I'm showing you my power. I'm going to execute Mordecai because he refuses to bow down and honor me and respect me. And this is just a message. I'm sending a message to everybody, and especially the Jews, but everybody in Persia. If you refuse to honor me, that's what awaits you. And so the friends and the wife tell him to build this gallows 75 feet high to impale Mordecai on. And then they say, go to the king in the morning to have Haman hanged on it, and don't let Mordecai ruin your banquet tomorrow. That's the idea. Look, if he's upsetting you this much, let's get rid of him before the banquet tomorrow. Then you can go to the banquet and really enjoy the banquet. You don't have to worry about it. And I think they had a second motive too. Then you won't come back home and we have to listen to all your boasting again. Someone said pride is the only known disease that makes everyone sick except the person who has it. Well, I think he was making his friends and his wife sick. But I want you to see that this suggestion delighted Haman, and so he had the gallows built through the night. But that gallows was an essential part of God's plan. That gallows was a necessary part of God's answer to the cries and the prayer of the Jews. Now, they didn't know that. And we don't know that so often when God lets things happen to us that appear to be very negative, very bad. But these gallows were there so God could show Susa who he wanted to show being executed. God wanted to show Susa, the city of Susa, Haman's execution and God's judgment upon him. So, Esther's hesitation led to Haman going out, becoming enraged, and then building his gallows. There's an interconnection there. You wouldn't have known that. That looks like two separate things. If you didn't know the story, it just looked like two separate events. And that leads to a third event, and that is Xerxes' insomnia. And we see this in chapter 6, verses 1 through 5. Notice it says right away, that night, circled that night. That night. It's not any ordinary night. It's not just another night. It's that night. There comes a time when God says, now. Now's the time. That night is the time. And that night, notice, it just so happened, it doesn't say that, but you could write that in there. It just so happened that night the king could not sleep. Well, what night was that? Well, that was the night when the gallows were being built to hang Mordecai. That was the night when, if God does not intervene, Mordecai is going to be killed. And so that night, the king is tossing and turning, pounding his pillow. And maybe he's hearing the sawing and the pounding of the hammers as the gallows are being built. It might be that the building of the gallows was helping to keep him awake. That's a possibility. But we don't know for sure. It's just a curiosity. What we do know for sure is this: God was really keeping Xerxes from sleep. I'm telling you, a jar of Ambien or an anesthesiologist could not have knocked this guy out. This guy had no chance of getting any sleep because God was working providentially. It was that night, and there was nothing that was going to stop God from accomplishing his plan. And that night then, it just so happens that after Xerxes can't get to sleep, that he orders for someone to read him a bedtime story. And what better story to read than one about himself? Reminds me of the movie star that went to a party and he had a group of people standing around and he was just every word was just about himself. And finally he said, well, we've been talking too much about me. Let's talk about you. What did you think about my last film? That's what happens when people are all caught up in themselves. Well, Xerxes is another one that's caught up in himself. And so he wants to hear about himself. And so he asks the person to get the record of his reign. Now, the record of his reign was a written record of facts and events that had occurred throughout his reign. In other words, they kept details of what happened in his reign. And keep in mind, he's been reigning now for 12 years. There's a lot of details in there. There's a lot of facts. There's a lot of events that are recorded. This may have even been in a number of volumes of scrolls or whatever. But this man who he asked to get the record of his reign goes and he picks out maybe one particular scroll. Doesn't know what he's picking out, just grabs one. Maybe it was for the scroll for year number 7 of his reign. And it just happened to be the scroll that recorded Mordecai's reporting of his assassination attempt. And that scroll would have had lots of events, maybe the whole year's worth of events, but that gentleman opens up the scroll right to where he reads about Mordecai. Huh. Now, isn't that a coincidence? That's what many people would say, right? There's no such thing as a coincidence, unless we want to say divine coincidence. It's God's providence. That's how God works. God's providence is like his fingerprints. He does little things that leave little fingerprints. You can't see him, but when you can look back, you suddenly see, oh, God's fingers were all over that. And God's fingers were all over this. Xerxes is asked, well, what was done? What was done for Mordecai? Go ahead, read me what was done for Mordecai after he reported the assassination attempt. And the man started to read and he said, oh, we're jumping off to another thing. Nothing was done. Nothing was done for him. Well, listen, kings always quickly rewarded those who did him good and quickly punished those who did him bad, because he had to maintain loyalty and honor. And if he doesn't reward somebody for saving his life, that can lead to demoralizing situations, and there's a lot of intrigue in the palace, as we've seen already. These guys were trying to assassinate the king. Xerxes eventually is assassinated in 465 BC. So he does eventually get assassinated. So there's a lot of intrigue there. So the kings were known to quickly reward and quickly punish in order to maintain loyalty, either out of gratitude or out of fear. But Mordecai was overlooked, so the king he's shocked, he's stunned. How could I have done this? But see, Mordecai's reward was in wait time. His reward was in wait time. 5 years earlier, he had reported the assassination attempt. 5 years have gone by. And his reward's been forgotten, except God never forgot it. God doesn't forget rewards. But God put it into wait time in order to give it to him at the right time. And there might be some of us here that have felt like we've been overlooked. Maybe we've been skipped over. Maybe we feel like we haven't been given what's really rightfully ours. Maybe we feel like we've been forgotten. Maybe that feel like God doesn't even remember what's happened to us here. God knows. And God's going to reward us at the right time. Some of it might be down here that he'll use to accomplish his purpose. Some of it may not happen till we get to the other side. But we'll be thankful for that either way. But God never forgets to reward his people. So Xerxes now wants to do the right thing. He wants to right this wrong. And that brings us to that verse I shared last week, Proverbs 21:1, where the king's heart is like an irrigation canal in the hands of the Lord. It's directed by the Lord. He guides it wherever he pleases. An irrigation canal is connected to the main source of water, and then it's directed to wherever they want the water to go. Who's the main source? God's the main source. And that's what it's telling us there, is that the king's heart is like an irrigation canal, that God is the main source, and he's going to put his favor through the king's heart to whoever he wants to give it to. And he wants to give his favor now Isn't that something? Let me read that again while he's doing that. Providence weaves through time and circumstances like a spider carefully crafting its web. Each movement may not appear to be leading to anything significant until the entire web has been completed, but every movement and motion matter. And that is the truth of God's providence. Like a divine spider, God has